Hi again, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at some of the things that we can do to get the best final render from FL Studio. This is going to be kind of a mini tutorial. We're not really going to be doing too much hands-on stuff, but I want to go over each option that we have available in the render screen so that you can better understand why each option is there and when and why you should or should not use each one. So to start with, basically whenever you render, you want to make sure to use the highest possible settings, of course. One of the things that I hear most often about FL Studio is that the audio engine isn't up to par with programs like Cubase and Pro Tools. It's not really true. It's only because of the way that FL Studio is set up, you have different audio output settings, which we'll get to in a little bit. So let's go ahead and open up the export screen so that we can see what we're working with. Go to Wave. Save that as whatever. Okay, so we have our render screen right here with our different options. First and foremost, whenever you're doing a final render, you want to export as WAV. WAV files are essentially going to be a mirror image of what you're working with. You have the option for MP3, but as we all know, MP3 files are compressed, and in compressing, they lose some needed clarity and depth. So always use WAV files for final renders. The only time I would suggest using MP3 is if you're just demoing some stuff, or you have a very large file and you need to transfer it quickly, but for a final render, you really shouldn't use it. And the MIDI option isn't something that should be used for a final render. That's more for exporting MIDI notes for a program or a piece of hardware. Now I want to briefly touch on what interpolation is and why it's important. If you're using samples, think about it like this. When you zoom in on a waveform, the closer you get, the more the smooth curves become pixelated lines. If you have any kind of pitch change, for example, or you've transposed something, those lines can get out of sync with the program's data points. This is going to give us high-frequency artifacts in our final render, and this could greatly affect our output. This is called aliasing. So the interpolation method is basically anti-aliasing the audio output. FL Studio recommends using at least 64-point sync, but my recommendation is to use the 512-point sync. This is going to take a little bit longer, and a little warning box will come up. Get it when I change this. There we go. And it just goes through and tells you that it's going to be a little bit slower. But again, it mentions here you might want to use this for your last rendering. But even with it taking a little bit of extra time, we're talking about your final render. So you should be prepared to take the time necessary to let the program work. And I found that it really doesn't take that much longer to use this setting. Again, the results will be worth it. And what I was saying earlier about FL Studio, about people saying that it has a bad audio engine, it's mainly because you can go into your settings and you can change the real-time settings to a different quality than the final output. So while you may have your real-time settings set low and your final render settings set high, when you're listening to the real-time audio as you're working, you might say, well, the sound quality doesn't sound as good. And that's just because in order to save CPU and RAM and let the program have the maximum potential, the default setting is lower. So what you can do is go into your settings and change that. But a lot of people, unfortunately, don't realize that, and they end up walking away from FL Studio because they think it has a lower quality audio engine. So the things that we want to make sure you have selected here under quality, again, make sure that you have this 512-point sync selected. Dithering, again, works as an anti-alias for our audio. Without going into too much detail, dithering is the process of correcting bit conversion errors. When we're using 16-bit audio, the dithering option is available, but if we change the bit depth to 32-bit, the dithering option is going to be blacked out there. So just make sure to select the dithering option on final renders in order to keep those artifacts from popping up. The alias-free TS404 is basically just going to anti-alias the TS404. If you're not using TS404 in your project, it's not really necessary. You don't have to have that selected. HQ for all plugins is basically going to be high quality mode for all plugins. And again, this needs to be selected if you're using any effects or generators to make sure that they render in high quality. And then finally, disable max poly is going to be something else to keep selected. That way you can make sure that all your notes come across. And this will also ignore the max poly setting in the miscellaneous channel settings. Now when selecting a bit rate, keep in mind that 16-bit audio is CD quality audio. If you're exporting to burn directly to CD, go ahead and select this option. But if you're planning to export to load into a wave editor or another program, my recommendation would be to select this 32-bit float 0.24. And the next option here, 32-bit float 16.8, this actually renders to a format that's read by Adobe Audition, which is another audio editing program. But rendering to this isn't going to be anything that can be used anywhere else. So again, if you're doing a final render and you're going to be editing it someplace else, go ahead and choose this 32-bit float point 24. And of course, if you are rendering to MP3, go ahead and make sure that it's on the highest bit rate, just 320 kilobits per second. Also, make sure to keep an eye on the looping mode over here. You have three options. Cut remainder is going to do just that. It's going to cut the end off of the track after the last bar is played through. Leave remainder is good if you're using effects like delay or reverb. That will allow all the effects to completely fade out before cutting off. And then wrap remainder is going to be something useful if you're like looping, you're making loops and stuff like that. I'll usually use this option if I'm exporting loops for other people to use in other programs. Now, one thing to mention about wrap remainder is, especially again if you're using effects like delay or reverb, you have to be kind of careful. Sometimes you have to work with it a little bit in order to get everything to sound right. Then we have down here, you have with these options, save acidized. It's going to save it acidized, but it's also going to save the time information with the file, so that way nobody has to use a beat calculator to find out the tempo and stuff. So I always do that, again, especially if I'm exporting for other people to use. Split mixer tracks is going to be good if you are planning on like bouncing some tracks down. You can just put them all on a different mixer channel and then choose this option. One cool thing about this option is that it doesn't take any longer to export this way as it does for a normal track, so that will go ahead and batch export everything into separate WAV files. And then of course save slice markers again is something you want to select if you're wanting to make sure to keep any kind of markers intact. The last thing that I would recommend choosing when you're doing a render is to select this background rendering option. This is going to be good if you've got like a large file, a long file, and you're going to have to take some time to render. This will minimize the program and allow you to continue to work on other things, but it's going to take a little bit longer. But again, if you have other things to do and you don't want to keep the PC locked down, I would go ahead and choose that option. But in the end, keep in mind that your final render is only as good as your mix. You want to use your ears, and even using all these settings isn't going to make bad music sound good. So keep in mind that if you render your project and it sounds bad, go back and look over the samples you're using, the effects, the settings, and how you've got everything mixed, because it might just be something that needs to be adjusted in the mix. So again, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.